Have you ever felt that one firm word, one line drawn in silence, could change the entire atmosphere of a relationship? A boundary can be that decisive, not the kind of wall made of fear or spite, but the sealed gate of a city, iron closing with one true click. When it shuts, the marketplace inside your life changes. Who may enter? Who trades with your attention? Who lingers in your energy? All of it shifts. And those who were only feeding on your openness, they find themselves outside on the street, fading back into the crowd. Most of us don't notice the gate until it slams. What we call attraction is often the shadow mirror at work, the unconscious pattern that keeps pulling us toward the same old figures, the unavailable, the manipulative, the ones who look different on the surface but carry the same unfinished story from childhood. It's as if an unresolved parental complex is standing behind them, polishing a glass that reflects our wound back at us. Each time we step into that reflection, we're rewired to accept what we once had to survive. Neuroscience tells the same story in its own language. A trauma bond is not mystical. It is chemistry, dopamine spiking with intermittent reward, oxytocin flooding when closeness is rare, cortisol rising when withdrawal feels like threat. It is a slot machine rigged with hope. One principled boundary is like pulling the plug on the machine. The lights flicker, the coins stop, and suddenly you see that the house was always winning. Men in particular are often trained to keep playing the game. We inherit cultural scripts. Be the provider, the protector, the performer. Those roles can feel like ceremonial armor, polished, impressive, but heavy, and hiding the wounds beneath. In that armor, many tolerate abuse without naming it, convinced that endurance equals strength. Yet what it often breeds is quiet suffering, the sense that being used is a man's duty. But the stakes of not acting are high. Without a boundary, the cycle repeats, gaslighting unchallenged, enmeshment deepening, demand-avoidant traps tightening around your daily life, and the promise is both simple and difficult. One act, done once with clarity, can dismantle those traps. Not because it magically fixes the other person, but because it reintroduces you to yourself. So the question that guides us here is this: what happens when one boundary, only once, not rehearsed forever, not argued endlessly, is set with such integrity that toxic people simply cannot stay? There is a paradox at the heart of so many men's struggles with limits. The louder the need for peace becomes inside, the quieter the voice is that says no. The shadow thrives in this silence. Jung described shadow as the unacknowledged part of us, the instincts and truths we repress to stay accepted. For many, repression takes the form of avoiding conflict, carrying the belief that harmony must be preserved at all costs. But that harmony is often false, more like a truce signed under duress. Behind this lies a silent wound. If as a child you learned that speaking up meant being punished, abandoned, or ignored, your nervous system equated negotiation with loss. You internalized the belief that appeasement was survival. You became fluent in scanning moods, placating, softening your own truth, all strategies to keep the bond intact. In adulthood, those same strategies become chains. The triggers today are familiar echoes of yesterday. You notice that when you concede, the other person doesn't soften. They escalate, their demands grow, and instead of relief, you feel hollow. A fear stirs. If you insist on your line, they may leave, and the old abandonment wound reopens. At the same time, an urgency presses on you, the compulsion to repair, to keep the connection intact at all costs. This cycle is not weakness. It is conditioning, replaying itself. Let's pause on one subtle role many fall into: the polite martyr, outwardly calm, endlessly accommodating, inwardly eroded. Every concession trains the other person's nervous system to expect more. Predators, whether conscious or not, learn through confirmation bias. If you yield once, they will expect you to yield again. The martyr thinks he is buying peace. In reality, he is teaching the other to consume more of him. Jung reframed boundary setting as an act of individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement in the pop sense. It is the process of becoming whole, allowing the self, the deep core of who you are, to lead over the persona, the mask you wear for approval. Saying no once can be a sacrament of adulthood, because it proclaims, the self is stronger than the mask. And here lies the counterintuitive pivot. You don't need to argue, persuade, or justify. Negotiation often fuels escalation. A single no, delivered with calm finality, can halt the pattern. In behavioral terms, it is extinction. When the supply is cut off, the cycle ends. There is a practical way to anchor this shift. 3 steps. First, name the behavior to yourself. Clarity begins internally. Second, state one concrete limit: a behavior, a time, a place. Third, pair it with a proportional consequence, not screamed, not dramatized, but enacted calmly. Then exit, apply once. Then let the interaction breathe for 24 hours before revisiting. This rhythm gives your system time to reset, and the other person time to reveal whether they can respect the line. The principle may sound abstract until you see it lived. In a community thread, a man described setting one boundary with his partner. He told her he would no longer engage in conversations where contempt was present. The partner erupted. Days of silence followed. Then, a week later, she returned, seeking repair. What shifted was not her sudden enlightenment, but his nervous system breaking free from the trauma bond. The boundary created distance, and distance revealed reality. Boundaries, in this sense, are less about controlling others, and more about rewriting the story the shadow has been telling, that saying no equals being abandoned. Each act of self-respect proves the opposite. One of the hardest truths to face is this: what keeps a toxic bond alive is not simply the other person's hunger, but our own compulsion to feed it. The shadow dynamic here is subtle. We often project our own sense of deficit onto the other, believing that their bottomless need obligates us to keep giving. Jung might call this the wounded carer archetype, the part of us that confuses love with rescue. The silent wound is usually old. Many men learned hyper-responsibility from childhood enmeshment. A parent leaned on them for comfort, approval, or stability, long before their nervous system was ready to carry that weight. The child learned, "My value is in rescuing. If I withdraw, I am worthless." That script often follows into adulthood, binding us to relationships where giving never ends. This is why boundaries can feel like betrayal. When you step back, the toxic partner often frames your withdrawal as proof of disloyalty. Suddenly, you're not just setting a limit, you're accused of abandoning. That forbidden drama reignites the attachment circuits. The body responds with rumination, as though pulling away equals danger. Then comes the seductive promise: if I just try harder, they'll stay. If I just give more, I'll finally be enough. What feels like love is often a dopamine-laced hope cycle. Biology explains the stickiness. A trauma bond mimics addiction. Intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable cycle of reward and punishment, keeps dopamine firing, just like a slot machine. Add oxytocin, the bonding hormone released during moments of closeness, and you have a chemical tether. Withdrawal triggers cortisol, the stress hormone, which makes the absence feel unbearable. It's not weakness that draws you back, it's neurochemistry. Attachment theory shows why this pattern cuts so deep. Anxious attachment collapses in withdrawal. The nervous system expects constant reassurance, and when it doesn't come, panic sets in. Yet paradoxically, the very cut we fear is the one that resets the system. A single, consistent break in supply collapses the reinforcement schedule. The game only works when you keep playing. Here is an inversion worth holding. Withholding presence is not cruelty. It is not punishment. It is a physiological reset. By stepping back, you are no longer fueling a hijacked pair bond. The nervous system begins to stabilize, and clarity re-emerges. A way to experiment with this shift is simple: the 24-hour absence. Remove one form of supply for a single day. No explanatory text, no emotional labor. Instead, observe yourself. Keep a log. Note the craving, the shame, the relief. Write down the time, the intensity, the thought content. You may find that the craving peaks and then recedes, like any withdrawal. And in the quiet that follows, a new kind of presence surfaces, not tied to someone else's need, but to your own center. Culture has always hinted at this dynamic. In film noir, when the antagonist vanishes from the scene, the protagonist suddenly realizes how dependent he was on their presence. The absence itself becomes revelation. The same applies here. When the toxic figure disappears, what surfaces is not only relief, but a sobering recognition. Dependence was masquerading as devotion. Boundaries, then, are less about pushing someone away and more about letting the fog lift. The vanishing act is not magic. It is chemistry unwinding, and what remains is the quiet ground of your own sovereignty. There is a tension many men live with, but rarely name. On one side is the urge to protect themselves. On the other is the belief that doing so would be cruel. This is the repression of aggression, a shadow dynamic where the raw energy of self-defense is buried under the demand to remain endlessly kind. The fear is not of conflict itself, but of being judged heartless. Beneath this repression lies another wound. In many cultures, the masculine archetype has been taught that softness equals failure. To assert a line, to say enough, carries shame, as if dignity depended on carrying more than you should. The belief takes root: I must be kind at all costs. But when kindness has no limits, it becomes a tactical failure. Slowly, identity erodes. Triggers make this clear. You tell yourself you will not resort to harshness, so you avoid strategic firmness. Yet resentment builds, and you rebel quietly against your own passivity. Then the appeal of authority calls you back. Strategy feels urgent, even intoxicating, when you finally glimpse it. And in that moment of clarity, you see the hidden truth. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion. It is collusion with manipulation. This is the empathy trap. Over-applied compassion becomes a tool for others to exploit. Manipulators thrive not on cruelty, but on your reluctance to stop them. They weaponize your conscience, turning your fear of being unkind into their permission slip. What feels like mercy is, in practice, surrender. Here, the old philosophers become unexpectedly useful. Machiavelli, often misunderstood as cynical, was clear about sovereignty. Strategy protects the mission. Nietzsche reframed it as will to power, not as domination, but as the ethical act of living in alignment with one's telos, the core purpose that makes life meaningful. Applied here, the lesson is simple. Boundaries preserve the mission of your life. Without them, your telos is eroded by the demands of others. Consider the reverse perspective. Some people wield gentleness as a weapon. They present softness as virtue while extracting your labor, time, or attention with mastery. Anti-strategy often masquerades as morality, but in practice it corrodes both parties. Refusing to use strategy does not make you noble. It makes you vulnerable to being drained. This is why a tactical protocol can help. 3 steps anchor it. First, define your mission, the sacred line you will not betray. Second, choose a proportionate boundary, one that fits the situation. Third, communicate it once in neutral language and then enact it. A phrase might be as simple as, I will not continue when the tone is contemptuous. I'll return when respect is present. Calm, clear, unnegotiated, and then you follow through. One coaching story illustrates the shift. A man who had spent years pleading for better treatment replaced his explanations with one firm phrase. The effect was immediate. His partner withdrew, contact thinned, and with it, the endless cycle of arguments. He reported unexpected results, hours of regained time, a sharp drop in obsessive rumination, and nights of deeper sleep. The line he drew was not grandiose. It was proportionate. But in enacting it, he reclaimed his inner authority. Boundaries at this level are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of sovereignty. Compassion without clarity dissolves into collusion. Compassion with clarity transforms into strength. And the paradox emerges again. What feels Machiavellian from the outside may in fact be the most humane act you can take, because it protects both your mission and the dignity of the bond. One decisive boundary can do more than shift a relationship. It interrupts projection. The shadow can no longer script your behavior because the line refuses to play its part. It collapses reinforcement. The cycle of dopamine and intermittent reward no longer has a stage on which to perform, and it restores agency, the sense that you can choose your response instead of being compelled by fear, guilt, or longing. Of course, one act is not always sufficient. Sometimes a single boundary reorders the dynamic entirely. Other times, escalation is required. Therapy, community support, even legal intervention when harm is persistent or dangerous. Discernment matters. The point is not to rely on endless confrontation, but to recognize when one boundary is enough and when a stronger container must be built. To anchor this process, consider a simple forward metric, a 7-day integrity check. Did you maintain the line you set? What shifted in your inner climate when you did? Did your sleep deepen? Did rumination quiet? Did anger settle into calm? These are the quiet signals that boundaries are not just social maneuvers, but nervous system medicine. Perhaps the best way to hold this is through one final image. Picture a lighthouse in heavy fog. The beam is not frantic. It does not chase the ships. It does not argue with the sea. It turns steadily with patient rhythm. And in that consistency, the fog reveals itself. Ships reroute. Predators surface. The presence of the light changes the entire scene. One boundary, held once, can be that kind of beam.
So the question you might carry after this is not, how do I get others to change? But rather, what would it mean if one clear line of mine stayed steady in the fog?